The design of Canberra is the result of an international design competition that was held over 12 months in 1911. The competition itself was rather controversial as the Minister for Home Affairs, King O'Malley, had the final say on the winners. 137 entries were received despite the Royal Institute of British Architects boycotting the competition. After 12 weeks of deliberation and an hour-long ceremony in Melbourne, King O'Malley announced the winners on the 23rd of May, 1912. In first place was Walter Burley Griffin. In second place was Eliel Saarinen. And in third place was Alfred Gash. The Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs persuaded King O'Malley to purchase the Griffiths, Coulter and Caswell design as well. We're all familiar with Griffin's design, but in this episode of the Canberra series, we're going to take a look at the other three designs chosen by O'Malley and the Departmental Board. First up is Finnish architect Eliel Saarinen's second place design. Saarinen's design imposes itself upon the landscape, basically flattening the Molonglo Valley. Some sections would require a rather large amount of infill and levelling of hills. For example, where the Prime Minister's residence is located, it would need almost 20 metres of fill. The Molonglo River would be dammed into a rather angular snake that needed at least 10 bridges to cross. It would be divided by mini lakes or ponds set at 4 different heights, separated by weirs. Saarinen believed this and the height of the streets above the water would reduce the likelihood of flooding, despite the majority of the city being built upon the floodplain. On the flip side, the annual rainfall wouldn't have been enough to fill up the lakes. To this end, Saarinen suggested building a dam somewhere to act as a reservoir to maintain the minimum water level. Where this dam should be, he doesn't say. But if you needed a big hole, I'd suggest Queanbeyan. Saarinen wanted to ensure that motor vehicles could travel through the city with ease, expecting the larger streets to have fast lanes for cars. Secondary streets that ran in parallel would be used by slower vehicles, with houses on these streets sacrificing their front yards if the need for road widening ever arose. Most streets in this design have a curve to them, preventing you from seeing from end to end. Saarinen had hoped that town planners would build houses that reduce the obstruction of sight down these streets as to encourage ease of travel. But if getting lost was a major concern, then why would you draw curved streets in the first place? Dominating the skyline, the municipal district features 8 departmental buildings, houses for the Prime Minister and the Governor-General, positioned in a semicircle with the Parliament sitting above them. A public woodland or park would stand behind it and an ornamental pond following the axis in front of it. Across the river, the university and hospital would have been built. In the circular pond to the northwest stands the National Monument, which could have been a war memorial, with the National Library and Museums framing the axis. And on the opposite end, the Central Railway Station and the Commercial District. Further east, across the river, is the industrial area, close to where Fyshwick and Kingston are today. The prevailing winds would protect the inhabitants of the city from factory smoke and noise pollution. Food and supplies for the city would be brought in via rail to the south of the industrial area and commercial district, while trams would ferry people through the city. The majority of judges were impressed by the grandeur and the geometry of this design, but it is as grand as it is expensive to build. It disrespects the landscape and is rather European, drawing comparisons to London and Helsinki. Speaking of European-style cities, Alfred Gash's design came third. Heavily inspired by Paris, his design relies on a rectangular grid with a central axis divided into quarters. Agache was enamoured by the new technology of aeroplanes, so all of his perspectives are drawn as if seen from a plane. Many people thought this was a novel way of presenting a future city, but found his plan to be rather impractical. Each quarter is named after its concrete raison d'etre, and its characters generally defined by an edifice or a group of buildings directly in the centre. Let's start off with the political quarter. Sitting on top of a flattened Kurrajong hill, the Houses of Parliament are 2 separate buildings. Some might say the current houses are far enough from each other. Imagine needing to go outside in the Canberra winter to chat to old mate in the lower house. Similar to Saarinen, 8 departmental buildings sit in a semicircle, with the houses of the Governor-General and Prime Minister positioned in the gap. It's interesting to see the emphasis that was put into housing these two. Granted, the Prime Minister and the Governor-General are pretty important to our democracy, but I don't think they're worth putting smack bang in the middle of the city. In the centre is the National Monument, designed to be the centrepiece of the quarter. This too could have been a war memorial were this design built. Stepping down from the political quarter is the administrative quarter, home of the mint, law courts, printing houses, and other functions needed to run a country and government. Surrounding the central train station is the commercial quarter, where one could visit the post office or do a touch of retail therapy. Just next door is the business quarter, home to all the banks and the stock exchange, busy during the day and practically abandoned at night. Connected by rail, the industrial quarter sits at the base of Black Mountain. What is odd is the proximity of the People's Palace, playgrounds and housing to the gasworks and government factories. Agache says air pollution would not be an issue for the homes nearby, but doesn't explain how. The workers would most likely be the ones living closest to it, while more middle and upper class families would live in villas and mansions scattered around the hills. Agache has attempted to get around flooding issues by having parks built on the shores of the river, but he also expects there to be locks and weirs to hold back the flow. Large sections of the map are dedicated to massive facilities such as the jail, barracks, cemetery, and a lunatic asylum. Could you imagine Canberra having one of those? He also has examples of an Arc de Triomphe and other French-style monuments for the city. This design is ambitious beyond its means. The Canberra population wouldn't have even supported this infrastructure for decades. These were the two official runners-up, but David Miller, the Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs, wasn't such a fan. He much preferred entry 10, Griffiths, Coulter and Caswell, the winner of the Minority Report. It was a compact design that didn't really exhibit anything remarkable in terms of axes or radials. The lake is basically the floodplain, but there's no artistic shape or form to it. The Parliament sits on Camp Hill, surrounded by the departmental buildings on the flat northeast of the hill. It had the initial city to the south in a valley that Charles Scrivener suggested it should be, where the suburb of Griffith is today. North of the river would also be residential, but town planners could ignore that until the population required it. The only major thing that was placed to the north were the barracks and the university, which also could be delayed. In this perspective, you can truly see how far south they wanted the city to be. Mount Ainslie stands alone, far from the city. It doesn't really look like a city either, more like a pastoral village with big bridges and scattered monuments. What's interesting about this design is that the three men probably had some level of insider knowledge of what Miller had wanted for the city. Coulter painted the cycloramas of the site and had even painted a romanticised version of a capital next to Wirrawar, Lake George, in 1901. Fun fact, Coulter put snow on top of Mount Bimbury even though he painted the cyclorama in the middle of summer. Caswell knew a thing or two about drainage, preparing the drainage reports for the site in 1909. Griffiths also worked under Caswell in the New South Wales Department of Works in the early 1900s, forming a working relationship. Even though the government bought his design, Caswell was a sore loser. He publicly ridiculed the jury for having a mechanical engineer instead of a civil engineer, and Griffin wasn't safe from his wrath either.
Griffin paid no attention to the contours or the broken nature of the ranges, but he conceived a fixed or formal design to cover all this ground as though it were quite level. And only by enormous excavation in the removal of high hills could certain parts be made practical.
Continuing his hissy fit, he writes to the judge that selected his entry as the winner.
Mr. Griffin personally told me that his design was completed in less than 6 weeks, and that he disregarded engineering considerations as they could be supplied subsequently.
Finishing his tirade by saying,
he also told a friend of mine that the design was drawn by his wife and 2 lady assistants.
Soon after the prizes were awarded, David Miller got to work building his own version of the city, using Condition 23 of the design competition to justify doing so. And what did they come up with? The Departmental Plan of 1912. A hodgepodge of a design that was basically the Griffiths, Coulter and Caswell design with Griffin's axes. The Parliament sits on Camp Hill, with the departmental buildings fanning around it to the northeast. Other than a hospital in Acton, the barracks and university could be indefinitely delayed. The initial city is placed in a tight crescent facing the railway station in the south. The Mount Vernon and Mount Pleasant axes still feature, but are so poorly implemented that roads go nowhere and the geometry crashes into natural features. The powerhouses in Kingston and the residence for the PM and Governor General are roughly in the position of this plan and still exist to this day. The Departmental Board designed an English village posing as a city. They scattered monuments with no rhyme or reason. Did the board really think Australians thought so little of their new capital and deeply craved something so English? We know the Departmental Board plan was not built, as in May 1913, Joseph Cook became Prime Minister with a majority of 1. Joseph Cook took on the portfolio of Home Affairs, but gave the responsibility of building the capital to Minister William Kelly. The first thing Kelly did was to invite Griffin to Australia, so we get the lay of the land and figure out what the Departmental Board was looking for. Miller, the secretary, was not pleased, and caused major headaches for Griffin until he left in the 1920s. Fortunately, the government decided to follow Griffin's design after it was modified to the Departmental Board's liking, and it has been implemented to varying degrees of success over the last century. So you could say that even Griffin's design was never built. The opportunity to design a capital city from scratch only comes once in a lifetime. Griffin, Saarinen, and Agache threw everything they knew at the task, but in the end, only one design could win: a city like no other. Griffin's design is a true manifestation of Australian democracy, being one with the land and for the people. Saarinen imposed his design upon the valley, digging and filling and bending the area to his will. Agache divided and conquered the landscape with ambitions of a sprawling metropolis that wouldn't exist for decades. Today, we live in a modern version of Griffin's design. Unfortunately, it's not perfect, and it has a lot of room for improvement. But I am so proud to be a Canberran and so fortunate to live in the bush capital. Would you have liked to have lived in Saarinen's or Agache's design? Do you think the Departmental Board was too power hungry? Let me know in the comments below. But if you've enjoyed this video, feel free to like, comment, and share. And if you want to see more, hit that subscribe button.